The clang of the camp gates echoed like a final sentence. Yuki Tanaka stood in the back of the military truck, her wrists raw from rope burns, her uniform torn and stained with weeks of Philippine jungle mud. She was 24 years old, though she felt ancient. The war had aged her in ways that had nothing to do with time. Around her, dozens of other Japanese women huddled together, their faces masks of exhaustion and terror. They had been captured after their units scattered, supplies gone, hope abandoned. Now they were being delivered to the enemy. Close your eyes and think of the emperor, Yuki told herself. Prepare for the worst. She had heard the stories. Every Japanese soldier had heard the stories. Americans were monsters cloaked in uniforms. They tortured prisoners. They performed experiments. They did unspeakable things to captured women before disposing of them like broken equipment. She had prepared herself for death. She had made peace with it in the jungle when starvation and disease seemed like the gentler options compared to American captivity. But when the truck rolled through the gates of the prisoner camp in Texas, the scene that greeted her struck her silent. The camp was not a dungeon. It was orderly, clean. Barracks lined in neat rows under a vast American sky that stretched from horizon to horizon, bigger than any sky she had ever seen. Guards watched closely but not cruelly, and in the distance, she saw something she had not witnessed in years. A garden blooming with vegetables tended by soldiers who whistled as they worked. Her blood did not run cold with fear. It ran cold with confusion. Was this the enemy? What she would discover in the weeks and months to come would challenge everything she had been taught. About Americans, about enemies, about the walls we build between ourselves and those we are told to hate. And it would begin with the smallest of gestures, a packet of medicine left on her bunk, a pair of steady eyes that saw her not as an enemy, but as a person. This is the story of a Japanese prisoner and an American soldier, of forbidden glances and secret messages written in the margins of borrowed books, of a love that grew in the shadows of war, nurtured by kindness that defied everything both had been taught to believe. It is a story most people have never heard. And once you hear it, you will never forget it. If this story grabs your attention, make sure to subscribe for more incredible World War II history that you will not find anywhere else. What happens next will show you that even in the darkest chapters of human conflict, the heart finds ways to reach across impossible divides. Who was Yuki Tanaka? To understand what happened inside that Texas camp, we must first understand who Yuki Tanaka was before the war made her a prisoner. She was born in Tokyo in 1921, the eldest child of a schoolteacher father and a seamstress mother. Her childhood was filled with books and quiet afternoons in her father's study, learning calligraphy and reciting poetry that spoke of cherry blossoms and mountain streams and the ancient beauty of Japan. Her father died when she was 12, a sudden illness that took him in 3 days, leaving behind a wife with 2 children and no income. Yuki remembered standing at his funeral, holding her mother's trembling hand, watching the incense smoke rise into a gray sky, and wondering how the world could continue when everything had changed. Her mother took in more sewing work after that. Her fingers bled from endless stitching. Her eyes grew weak from poor light and long hours. But she never complained. She simply worked day after day so her children could eat and study and dream of futures beyond the cramped apartment where they lived. Yuki swore she would help. She studied harder than anyone in her class. She earned a place at a teacher training college when most girls her age were being prepared for marriage. By 19, she was teaching elementary school in a small Tokyo neighborhood, shaping young minds, believing in the future. She loved her students, their laughter, their curiosity, the way their faces lit up when they understood something new. She believed she had found her purpose. Her younger brother Kenji was 15 when she started teaching, a quiet boy who loved to draw, who filled sketchbooks with pictures of birds and buildings and the faces of people he saw on the street. He would show her his work in the evenings, eager for her approval, and she would tell him that someday his art would hang in galleries and museums. Then the war came. At first it was distant, radio reports of victories in China, in Southeast Asia, flags waving in the streets, parades celebrating the glory of the empire. Yuki taught her students to sing patriotic songs and draw pictures of brave soldiers and write letters to men they had never met who were fighting for Japan's honor. But the war grew closer. The victories became fewer. The radio reports became shorter, vaguer, filled with words like strategic withdrawal and tactical repositioning that even children knew meant something had gone wrong. In 1944, Yuki was conscripted into the Women's Volunteer Corps. She was assigned to work in a military communications center in the Philippines, far from the front lines, they promised. Safe duty for a young woman with education and skills. The promise was a lie. The fall by early 1945, American forces had landed in the Philippines. Japanese positions crumbled like sandcastles before a rising tide. Supply lines collapsed. Communications broke down. The center where Yuki worked was abandoned, its staff left to fend for themselves in the jungle, while officers fled to ships that would never return for them. For 3 weeks, Yuki and a handful of other women survived on rainwater and whatever they could forage from the hostile green darkness. 2 died from illness, their bodies buried in shallow graves marked with sticks that would rot and disappear within months. One woman, a clerk named Michiko, who had shown Yuki pictures of her infant daughter back home, disappeared into the jungle during the night and never returned. They heard gunfire sometimes, American patrols moving through the trees. Each time the women hid, pressing themselves into the mud, barely breathing, waiting for death that somehow never came. When the Americans finally found them, Yuki was so weak she could barely stand. Her uniform hung on her like a shroud. Her eyes had the hollow look of someone who had already said goodbye to life. She expected a bullet, a bayonet. Something quick if she was lucky. Instead, a young American soldier knelt beside her and offered his canteen. She stared at him, unable to process what was happening. He spoke words she did not understand, but his voice was gentle. He helped her drink, supporting her head with one hand while she swallowed water that tasted like life itself. Then she was given food, medical attention from doctors who did not look at her with hatred, but with something that confused her utterly: concern. And then she was put on a ship bound for America. The crossing, the voyage across the Pacific, took weeks. Yuki spent most of it below deck, surrounded by other prisoners. The smell of sweat and fear thickened the recycled air. She tried to sleep, but nightmares found her every time she closed her eyes. Dreams of her mother receiving a telegram with terrible news. Dreams of her brother Kenji, 17 years old now, being conscripted and sent to die on some island she would never see. Dreams of flames and falling bombs and a Tokyo that might no longer exist by the time she returned. If she ever returned. The propaganda had prepared her for American cruelty. But on the ship, the guards distributed rice and soup. They allowed the women to exercise on deck when the weather was calm, to breathe fresh air and feel the sun on their faces. A doctor checked for diseases and treated wounds with medicine that Yuki had not seen in months. It made no sense. Where was the torture? Where were the experiments? Where were the monsters she had been warned about? Yuki watched and waited for the cruelty to begin, for the mask to slip, for the Americans to reveal their true nature. But the mask never slipped. One guard, a boy who looked barely 18, offered her an orange one afternoon. He held it out with a shy smile, saying something she could not understand. When she hesitated, he peeled it himself and placed the segments on a clean napkin, then walked away without asking for anything in return. She ate the orange slowly, savoring each burst of sweetness, crying silently because she could not remember the last time anyone had given her something simply to be kind. By the time the ship reached the American coast, Yuki was more confused than afraid. Confusion, she would later realize, was the first crack in the wall she had built around her heart. The wall made of propaganda and fear and everything she had been taught about enemies. Camp Harris, Texas. Camp Harris sat in the flat, endless Texas landscape, surrounded by scrubland that stretched to every horizon. The sky was enormous, a dome of blue so vast it made Yuki feel simultaneously free and exposed, like a small creature caught in open ground with nowhere to hide. The camp had been hastily constructed to house the growing number of Japanese prisoners as the Pacific War wound toward its bloody conclusion. Wooden barracks painted white, a mess hall with smoke rising from its chimney, an administration building flying the American flag, those strange stripes and stars that Yuki had only seen in propaganda films, depicting American weakness and decadence. But there were also unexpected touches. A small garden near the mess hall where vegetables grew in neat rows, tended with obvious care. A recreation area with benches shaded by canvas awnings. A library building, small but real, with books visible through the windows. When the trucks carrying Yuki and the other women rolled through the gates on April 3, 1945, the first thing she noticed was the smell. Not the smell of death or decay she had grown accustomed to in the jungle. The smell of cooking food, meat and bread, and something sweet she could not identify. Her stomach cramped with a hunger she had forgotten she could feel. The women were processed efficiently, names recorded in ledgers, photographs taken for identification cards, medical examinations performed by a female doctor who spoke gently and touched carefully, treating them not like prisoners, but like patients who needed care. Inside the barracks, each woman received soap, clean bedding, and bowls of stew so thick with meat that Yuki's hands trembled when she held it. She sat on her assigned bunk and stared at the food, unable to eat. Beside her, a woman named Sachiko, 28 years old and a former military nurse who had been captured alongside her, watched with knowing eyes. Yuki whispered, "They are trying to trick us." Sachiko was quiet for a long moment. Then she whispered back, "Maybe, or maybe we were the ones who were tricked." Yuki did not understand what she meant. Not yet, but she would. The American soldier. It was during roll call on her fifth morning that Yuki first noticed him. Corporal Thomas Bennett stood at the edge of the formation, clipboard in hand, calling names with calm authority. His English words were punctuated by an interpreter's Japanese translations. But Yuki found herself listening to the original sounds, trying to parse their meaning, trying to understand the enemy's tongue. He was tall, broad-shouldered. His uniform was crisp despite the Texas dust that seemed to coat everything. His face was young, but his eyes were old, carrying a weight that seemed too heavy for someone his age. Unlike some guards who looked through the women as if they were shadows, or worse, looked at them with undisguised hatred. Bennett's eyes moved across the formation with something else. Awareness, recognition, as if he saw each woman as an individual person rather than a faceless enemy to be managed. When Yuki coughed, a remnant of bronchitis she had developed in the Philippine jungle, his gaze flicked toward her. Their eyes met for just a moment, a heartbeat, less than a second. Then he looked away, continuing the roll call as if nothing had happened. That night, Yuki found a small paper packet of lozenges on her bunk. She stared at it for a long time. The other women were asleep or pretending to be. The barracks were quiet except for the sound of breathing and the distant call of insects in the Texas night. She picked up the packet carefully, as if it might contain poison or a trap. She turned it over in her hands. Simple lozenges for cough relief. The kind of medicine that had been impossible to find in Japan for years. She knew it must have been him. No one else would have noticed her cough. No one else would have bothered to do anything about it. But why? Why would an American soldier, an enemy, care about a Japanese prisoner's health? She tucked the lozenges under her thin pillow and lay awake for hours, staring at the wooden beams above her bunk, trying to understand a world that no longer made sense. Thomas Bennett's war, what Yuki did not know, could not know, was the weight Thomas Bennett carried beneath his crisp uniform. He had grown up in rural Ohio, the eldest son of a carpenter father and a schoolteacher mother. His childhood was filled with the smell of sawdust and the sound of his mother reading poetry aloud in the evenings. Shakespeare, Whitman, Frost. Words that painted pictures bigger than their small town, dreams larger than the cornfields that surrounded them. His younger brother Daniel was born when Tom was 7. From the first moment he held that squirming, crying bundle, Tom felt something click into place in his chest. A purpose, a responsibility, a love so fierce it surprised him. They were inseparable growing up. Tom taught Daniel to fish in the creek behind their house, to throw a baseball without hurting his shoulder, to read before he started school. They shared a room until Tom left for the Army in 1942, and even then, they wrote letters every week, pages and pages of words that kept them connected across the miles. Daniel had his brother's blue eyes but a gentler soul. He rescued injured birds and nursed them back to health. He gave his lunch money to kids who had none. He believed in the basic goodness of people, even when the war news suggested otherwise. Daniel enlisted the moment he turned 18 in January 1945. He was eager, patriotic, determined to follow his big brother into service. Their mother cried when he left. Their father shook his hand and told him to come home safe. By February, Daniel was on a ship bound for the Pacific. By March, he was dead. Iwo Jima, one of the bloodiest battles of the war. 36 days of hell that killed nearly 7,000 Americans and over 20,000 Japanese. A volcanic island turned into a slaughterhouse where boys from Ohio and boys from Tokyo killed each other in caves and tunnels and on beaches, black with volcanic sand. Daniel was 19 years old. He had been in combat for less than a week. His body was never recovered. The telegram arrived at the Bennett home on a Tuesday afternoon in early April. Tom's mother collapsed on the kitchen floor. His father sat at the table and said nothing for 3 days, his face like carved stone, his eyes seeing something far away that no one else could see. Tom was stationed at Camp Harris when he learned. He read the telegram in his barracks, alone. The words blurring as tears he could not stop streamed down his face. Then he walked into the Texas scrubland and screamed until his voice gave out. He screamed at the sky and the dirt and the God who had let his baby brother die on an island Tom could not even find on a map. He screamed until his throat was raw and his legs gave out, and he collapsed on the ground, sobbing like the child he had not been for years. For weeks afterward, he felt nothing but hatred. He looked at the Japanese prisoners and saw the people who had killed Daniel. He wanted them to suffer. He wanted revenge. He wanted to hurt someone, anyone, to make them feel even a fraction of the pain that had hollowed out his chest. But revenge felt hollow. Every time he imagined acting on his hatred, he heard Daniel's voice in his head. Danny would have helped them. The thought came unbidden one night as Tom lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Danny would have seen them as people, not enemies. Danny would have offered water to a thirsty prisoner, medicine to a sick one. Danny would have chosen kindness because that was who Danny was. That was who Danny had always been. And Tom realized in that long, dark night that he had a choice. He could become what the war wanted him to be. Hard, cruel, filled with hatred for people he had never met. People who were themselves victims of a conflict started by men in power who would never face its consequences. Or he could honor his brother's memory. He chose. It was the hardest choice of his life. Every day looking at Japanese faces and fighting down the rage that wanted to consume him. Every day, choosing kindness when cruelty would have been so much easier. But he chose, again and again, because that was what Danny would have wanted, because that was the only way to keep Danny's spirit alive. The signs multiply. The signs multiplied over the following weeks. When the camp doctor was overwhelmed with patients and struggling to see everyone who needed care, Bennett guided Yuki and 2 other women to the infirmary, ensuring they received treatment before their coughs worsened into something more dangerous. When guards distributed mail from prisoners' families, rare packages that had somehow crossed the Pacific through Red Cross channels, Bennett always spoke softly to the women receiving them. His voice carried a warmth that transcended language, a gentleness that made even the harshest news easier to bear. When one of the older prisoners, a woman named Reiko Nakamura, stumbled during work detail and fell hard on the dusty ground, Bennett was there immediately. He helped her up with careful hands, called for water, examined her ankle to make sure it was not broken. He treated her with a respect that confounded everything Yuki had been taught about American soldiers. She began to watch him. Not obviously, not in ways that could be noticed or reported, but in the quiet moments during roll call, during meal distribution, during the long Texas evenings, when the sun painted the sky in colors she had no names for, her eyes found him. She told herself it was curiosity. She told herself she was studying the enemy, learning his patterns, looking for weaknesses that might someday prove useful. She was lying to herself. One evening, as Yuki carried laundry to the drying lines strung between barracks, she saw him leaning against the fence at the edge of the compound. He was speaking with another soldier, his posture relaxed, his face turned toward the setting sun. The sunset blazed behind him, turning his silhouette into something from a painting or a dream. Fire and gold and colors that seemed impossible outside of poetry. When his eyes caught hers, he paused mid-sentence. For a fleeting heartbeat, the chaos of war, the hatred of nations, The weight of captivity, all of it dissolved. There was only a man and a woman, looking at each other across a distance that felt both vast and impossibly small. Yuki looked away instantly, her cheeks burning with something she refused to name. She hurried toward the laundry lines, her heart pounding against her ribs. She told herself it meant nothing. But that night, when sleep eluded her and the barracks filled with the soft sounds of women dreaming, she saw his eyes again, behind her closed lids, in the darkness that should have been empty. Calm, steady, human. She pressed her hands to her face, ashamed of her own thoughts. The war within. The weeks passed. Routine settled over the camp like a blanket, comforting in its predictability, even as it suffocated with its sameness. Morning roll call, work details, meals in the mess hall, curfews, lights out. The rhythm of captivity became the rhythm of her days. Yet beneath that rhythm, another pulse began to beat. Quieter, more dangerous. Brief glimpses of Bennett, the quickening of her breath when his boots crunched on the gravel near her barracks, the tightening in her chest whenever he passed by. Close enough that she could smell soap and tobacco and something else, something clean and foreign that she could not identify. She hated herself for it. She hated herself for the way her heart raced when she saw him. She hated herself for the way she listened for his voice during roll call, picking out the sound of his English from the others, learning its rhythms even when she could not understand the words. She hated herself for the warmth that spread through her chest when he performed some small act of kindness toward another prisoner. Sachiko noticed. One night, as they lay in their bunks after lights out, Sachiko whispered, "You watch the tall one, the American with the sad eyes." Yuki's heart stopped. She whispered back, "I do not know what you mean." Sachiko was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Be careful. The heart does not care about nations or wars. It wants what it wants. But the world cares very much, and the world is not kind to those who forget which side they stand on." Yuki said nothing, but she knew Sachiko was right. The war between Japan and America was one thing, vast and bloody and beyond her control. The war inside her heart was something else entirely, smaller, more intimate, and far more dangerous. Because Yuki Tanaka, prisoner of war, sworn enemy of America, was beginning to feel something for her guard. Something forbidden, something that could destroy them both. Hook for part 2. But the small gestures would soon become something larger, something that could not be ignored or dismissed as coincidence. One afternoon in late October, as Yuki sat mending uniforms in the sewing hut, the door would creak open. Bennett would enter with a bundle of supplies, his stride casual but his eyes carrying unmistakable intent. As he passed her table, something small would slip from his hand, a folded scrap of paper, landing silently on the bench beside her. 3 words written in rough pencil that would change everything. "Do you read?" And Yuki would have to decide whether to answer, whether to reach back across the chasm that separated enemy from enemy, whether to risk everything for a connection that defied every rule, every law, every lesson she had ever been taught. Subscribe now, because what happens next will test everything she believes about loyalty, about love, and about the walls we build between ourselves and those we are taught to hate. The story of Yuki Tanaka and Thomas Bennett is far from over, and the hardest moments are still to come. The note. The turning point came on an ordinary afternoon in late October 1945. The women had been assigned to mend uniforms in the sewing hut, a tedious task that Yuki actually welcomed. The repetitive motion of needle and thread calmed her mind, gave her something to focus on besides the confusion churning inside her. She sat at a long wooden table, her fingers working through a tear in a soldier's jacket, when the door creaked open. She glanced up and froze. Bennett entered with a bundle of uniforms. His stride was casual, unhurried, the walk of a man performing routine duty, but his eyes flicked toward her with something that was not routine at all. He set the uniforms down on a table near the door. He spoke briefly with the interpreter, his voice steady and professional. Then he turned to leave. As he passed Yuki's table, something small slipped from his hand. A folded scrap of paper landed silently on the bench beside her. Her breath caught in her throat. She did not look at it. She did not move. She continued stitching as if nothing had happened. But her heart was pounding so hard she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. The door closed behind him. Yuki forced herself to count to 100 before she allowed her hand to drift casually toward the paper. She slid it beneath the fabric in her lap, her fingers trembling. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze. She made mistakes in her stitching. She pricked her finger twice, drawing blood that spotted the uniform she was mending. She could feel the paper burning against her thigh like a brand, demanding to be read. That night, beneath her thin blanket, she unfolded it with shaking fingers. The barracks were dark. The other women slept or pretended to sleep. Outside, insects sang their endless song into the Texas night. Yuki held the paper close to her face, straining to read in the faint moonlight that filtered through the window. 3 words scrawled in rough pencil. "Do you read?" Her heart hammered against her ribs. He was testing her, reaching across the chasm that separated enemy from enemy, prisoner from guard, Japan from America. 3 simple words that carried the weight of everything forbidden. She bit her lip, whispering the words to herself, tasting their foreign shape on her tongue. Yes, she could read a little English. Fragments she had learned in school before the war made such things dangerous. Phrases from books her father had kept hidden in his study. Enough to understand? She lay awake staring at the paper, turning it over and over in her fingers, wondering how she could answer, wondering if she should answer, wondering what would happen if anyone discovered what he had done. The next day, opportunity came disguised as accident. While carrying buckets of water across the yard, Yuki deliberately dropped one near the fence where Bennett stood on duty. As she bent to gather the handle, she slipped a folded scrap of her own beneath a stone at the fence post. Her note contained just one word, shaky but clear. Yes. That night, fear gnawed at her. What if another guard found it? What if Bennett denied everything and she was punished for treachery? What if this was all an elaborate trap designed to identify prisoners who might collaborate with the enemy? She barely slept. Every sound made her jump. Every footstep outside the barracks made her heart stop. Yet when she passed the same spot the following day, the stone was bare. Her note was gone. The book days passed in agonizing silence. Yuki told herself it was over, that she had been foolish, that Bennett had thought better of whatever impulse had driven him to reach out, that the note was now evidence in some file, and any moment guards would come to drag her away for interrogation. But the interrogation never came. Instead, on the 7th day, another scrap of paper appeared. This one was tucked into her folded laundry, placed there by hands she did not see. The words were slightly longer this time. Careful, patient, I bring book. And true to his word, a week later, an old battered English primer appeared on her bunk. It was hidden beneath linens that had been delivered during uniform distribution, smuggled in with such skill that no one noticed. Yuki opened it with trembling hands. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age. It was a children's book, the kind used to teach young students how to read. Simple words, simple sentences, pictures of cats and dogs and houses with white picket fences. But inside, in the margins, someone had written notes in pencil, tiny translations, short sentences, fragments of thought that spoke of a mind trying to bridge an impossible gap. She read them slowly, sounding out each word, piecing together meaning from context and memory and sheer determination. The sun is hot in Texas. I hope you are well. Your cough is better now. Simple words, ordinary observations. Nothing that would seem suspicious to anyone who found the book. But to Yuki, they were treasures. For weeks, the book became their secret bridge. Bennett would collect it under the guise of routine inspections, saying he needed to check the barracks for contraband. He would return it days later with new notes scribbled in the margins. Yuki devoured every word, every translation, every shaky sentence he left for her to practice. She began to write back. At first, just simple responses. Yes, thank you, I understand. Then gradually more. One evening, gathering her courage, she wrote in the margins, Your sky is big. My home sky was small. When the book returned, his reply was penciled beside her words. Same sky, different home. She traced the letters with her fingertip until they blurred with tears she refused to shed. 4 words that said everything. They lived under the same sky. They were both far from home. They were both human beings caught in something larger than themselves, something neither had chosen, something that demanded they hate each other. But they did not hate. They were reaching toward each other instead, and that was the most dangerous thing either of them had ever done. His words, her words. The notes grew longer as the weeks passed. Tom wrote about Ohio, about the fields of corn that stretched like golden oceans in autumn, about the creek behind his childhood home where he had learned to swim, about his mother's apple pie and his father's workshop and the smell of sawdust that meant safety and home. He wrote about books his mother had read to him, about dreams he had once harbored of becoming a teacher or a writer, about the war that had interrupted everything, that had turned boys into soldiers and soldiers into ghosts. He did not write about Daniel directly, not yet. The wound was still too fresh, but something in his words spoke of loss, a heaviness beneath the surface that Yuki could feel even when she could not name it. She wrote about Tokyo in return, about the cherry blossoms in Ueno Park that bloom for only 2 weeks each spring, clouds of pink and white that made the whole city feel like a dream, about her students' laughter and the chalk dust that coated her fingers after long days of teaching, about her mother's sewing and the click of her needles late into the night. She wrote about her brother Kenji and his drawings, about his dream of becoming an artist, about the last time she had seen him, standing at the train station as she left for the Philippines, waving until she disappeared from view. She did not know if Kenji was alive or dead. The not knowing was its own kind of torture, worse in some ways than certainty would have been. Two people, enemies by circumstance, building a bridge of words across an impossible divide. Each note was a risk. Each exchange could mean discovery, punishment, consequences neither wanted to imagine, but they continued anyway, because something had started between them, something neither fully understood, something that grew stronger with every word exchanged, every secret shared, every moment of connection in a world designed to keep them apart. The revelation. The revelation came on a December evening, cold enough that Yuki could see her breath misting in the air. She had been assigned to help in the camp kitchen, scrubbing pots after dinner. The work was hard, but she welcomed it. Physical exhaustion was easier to bear than the constant churning of her thoughts. When she finished, she stepped outside to empty a bucket of wash water. The yard was quiet, most prisoners already in their barracks for the night. Stars scattered across the Texas sky like diamonds on black velvet. Bennett stood near the fence, alone, his shoulders hunched against the cold. He was not on duty. He was simply standing there, staring at the stars. She should have walked away. Every instinct told her to avoid him, to protect both of them from the danger of being seen together. Instead, she found herself moving toward him. She stopped a few feet away, the fence between them. For a long moment, neither spoke. The cold wind cut across the yard, carrying the smell of mesquite and distant cattle. Then in halting English, she said, "You teach me words." "Why?" He did not turn to look at her. His voice was quiet, rough with something she could not identify. "My brother," he said, "young, like you." Yuki waited, sensing there was more. Bennett continued, his words slow and careful so she could understand. "He die. March. Island called Iwo Jima." The name hit her like a physical blow. Iwo Jima. She had heard the reports before her capture. A Japanese stronghold attacked by American forces, 36 days of fighting, thousands dead on both sides, one of the bloodiest battles of the entire Pacific War. She whispered, "Japanese soldiers killed him." Bennett finally turned to look at her. His eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. "War killed him," he said. "Hate killed him. Not you. Not any one person." He paused, struggling to find words simple enough for her to understand. "I want to hate," he said. "Easy to hate. But Danny, my brother, he was kind. Always kind. He not want me to hate." Yuki felt tears prick her own eyes. She said, "I am sorry. For your brother." Bennett nodded slowly. "I am sorry too," he said, "for everything this war take from everyone." They stood in silence, the cold wind cutting between them. Two people on opposite sides of a fence that suddenly seemed meaningless. She understood now. Thomas Bennett was not kind despite losing his brother to Japanese soldiers. He was kind because of it, because hatred would have been a betrayal of everything his brother believed in, because choosing humanity over vengeance was the only way to honor a gentle soul who had been destroyed by war. That choice, that impossible, beautiful choice, changed everything. For the first time since her capture, Yuki felt something crack open inside her chest. Not fear, not confusion. Something warmer, something more dangerous. Hope. Eyes on them. But secrecy was a fragile shield. Private Walter Harris had been watching. Harris was 32 years old, a man whose face seemed permanently twisted into a sneer. He had lost cousins at Pearl Harbor, friends in the Pacific. His hatred of the Japanese was not political, but personal, a burning coal in his chest that he fed with every slight, every rumor, every opportunity to inflict small cruelties. He noticed things other guards missed, the way Bennett's eyes lingered on the Japanese woman during roll call, the way she seemed to watch him in return. The primer being passed back and forth under the guise of inspections. Too many coincidences to be coincidence. One afternoon, Harris cornered Bennett near the gate. Yuki happened to be sweeping the yard nearby. She caught fragments of their words, though most slipped past her limited English. But she recognized her own name. Harris sneered, gesturing toward the women's barracks, then toward Bennett. His voice dripped with accusation. Words like traitor and collaborator and Jap lover cut through the air. Bennett's jaw tightened. His hands clenched at his sides. For a moment, Yuki thought he might throw a punch. Instead, he said something short and curt. Final. Harris spat into the dust and stalked away. Yuki's blood ran cold. That night, she found a hurried note tucked into her blanket. The handwriting was rougher than usual. Written in haste. Careful. Eyes on us. For days, she forced herself to avoid Bennett's gaze, to bury her feelings beneath routine, to become invisible, just another prisoner, indistinguishable from the rest. It felt like tearing her heart apart with her own hands. But even distance could not erase what had grown between them. When she caught a glimpse of him across the yard, when she heard his voice during roll call, the ache only deepened. The investigation. The crisis came 2 weeks later. Harris had filed a formal complaint. Bennett was summoned to Sergeant Crawford's office. Yuki learned about it from whispers among the prisoners, fragments of overheard conversations, the nervous glances of guards who knew something was happening, but not exactly what. She spent the afternoon in agony, unable to focus, unable to eat, waiting for news that never came. Inside Crawford's office, Bennett stood at attention while the sergeant reviewed the complaint. Sergeant Robert Crawford was 38 years old, a career soldier who had served in North Africa before being assigned to Camp Harris. He had seen too much war to have patience for pettiness, but he also could not ignore a formal accusation. He read the document slowly, then set it down on his desk. Harris claims you have been showing inappropriate attention to a Japanese prisoner, Crawford said, that you have been passing unauthorized materials, that your conduct is, and I quote, unbecoming of an American soldier. Bennett said nothing. He kept his eyes fixed on a point on the wall behind Crawford's head. Crawford continued, "Is any of this true?" Bennett met his eyes for the first time. "I gave her an English primer, Sergeant. I have been helping her learn to read." Crawford raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Bennett was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was steady but strained. "My brother died at Iwo Jima," he said. "He was 19 years old, the kindest person I ever knew. He would not have wanted me to treat anyone with cruelty, not even the enemy, especially not the enemy." Crawford studied him for what felt like an eternity. The clock on the wall ticked. Outside, a truck engine rumbled past. Then Crawford said, "The primer stays with me. You will have no further private contact with any prisoner. If Harris reports anything else, I will have no choice but to transfer you, possibly court-martial you. Is that understood?" Bennett said, "Yes, Sergeant." He was dismissed. That night, Yuki found a final note slipped under her bunk. It was written on a scrap so small she almost missed it. It said, "I am sorry. No more words for now, but I do not forget." She pressed the paper to her chest and wept silently, muffling her sobs in her thin pillow. The bridge they had built was crumbling. The connection that had sustained her through the long months of captivity was being torn away. But the words remained. "I do not forget." Neither would she. The storm months passed. The distance between them became routine. Bennett performed his duties. Yuki performed hers. They did not speak. They did not exchange notes. They barely looked at each other. But something remained. An invisible thread that stretched between them, unbroken despite the distance. A knowledge that existed in glances held a fraction too long. In the way he always seemed to be nearby when she needed help. In the way she found herself listening for his voice, even when she told herself to stop. Harris watched for weeks, then months, but found nothing. Eventually, he lost interest. There were other battles to fight, other grudges to nurse. The war in Europe had ended. The war in the Pacific was grinding toward its conclusion. Everyone knew it was only a matter of time. July brought the turning point neither expected. The women had been assigned to assist at a nearby farm, helping harvest vegetables under guard. It was meant as labor, but for Yuki, the change of scenery was a relief. Anything to escape the suffocating tension of the camp. The farm sat in a valley surrounded by low hills, the fields stretching out in neat rows of green and gold. The sun beat down mercilessly, but the work was simple and the guards were relaxed, allowing the women to talk and even laugh as they gathered beans and tomatoes and squash. Yuki was working around near the edge of the field when the sky changed. One moment, the sun blazed overhead. The next, clouds rolled in from the west with terrifying speed, black and swollen with rain. The wind picked up, whipping dust across the field. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Then the storm broke. Rain poured down in sheets, soaking everything in seconds. The temperature dropped. The wind howled. Lightning split the sky, close enough that Yuki could feel the electricity in the air. The guards shouted, herding the women toward a shed at the edge of the field. Everyone ran, slipping and sliding in the mud that had appeared as if by magic. In the chaos, Yuki stumbled. Her foot caught on something, a root or a rock hidden in the mud. She went down hard, landing on her hands and knees, pain shooting through her wrists. Around her, women ran past, heads down against the rain, not seeing her fall. She tried to rise, but the mud was slick and her legs would not cooperate. She slipped again, falling harder this time. Then strong hands caught her arms. She looked up, rain streaming down her face, blurring her vision. Bennett. He pulled her to her feet with one smooth motion, his hands warm and solid against her arms. For a breathless moment, they stood face to face, their bodies pressed close by necessity, the storm raging around them. Thunder cracked like artillery. Lightning illuminated his face, showing her eyes that held no hatred, no fear, only something raw and undeniable. The same thing she felt burning in her own chest. He guided her toward the shed, one hand on her elbow, supporting her through the treacherous mud. They reached cover just as the worst of the storm hit. Wind and rain and noise so overwhelming that speaking was impossible. They stood at the edge of the shed, separated from the other women by a few feet of space. Their clothes were soaked. Their hair dripped. Their breath came in gasps. He released her elbow as soon as they were safe. His face returned to neutral, the mask of a guard doing his duty. But his hands had trembled. She had felt it. And she knew in that moment that whatever existed between them was not one-sided, was not imagined, was not the desperate fantasy of a lonely prisoner clinging to any kindness offered. It was real. It was mutual. And it was more dangerous than anything she had ever known. Hook for Part 3. The storm passed. The sun returned. They went back to their separate worlds, prisoner and guard, enemy and enemy. But everything had changed. August would bring the end of everything they knew. Atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan's surrender. The announcement that would shatter the world and remake it into something new. For Yuki and Thomas, the end of war meant the end of their fragile world. The fence that separated them would soon vanish, but so too would the proximity that had allowed their connection to grow. She would be sent home to a country in ruins. He would remain in America, half a world away. In a garden heavy with summer heat, they would meet one final time. Words would be spoken that could never be taken back. A promise would be made that would echo across years and oceans. Subscribe now, because what happens next will break your heart and then piece it back together in ways you never expected. The final chapter of their story is coming. and it will change everything you believe about love, about loss, and about the promises we keep across impossible distances. The bomb's August shattered everything. The news spread through Camp Harris like wildfire on the morning of August 6, 1945. A bomb. One single bomb dropped on the city of Hiroshima that had destroyed everything within miles. Tens of thousands dead in an instant. Tens of thousands more dying from something the Americans called radiation, an invisible poison that killed slowly and terribly. The prisoners heard the news in fragments, whispered translations of radio broadcasts, overheard conversations between guards. The horror on American faces that seemed genuine, not triumphant. Yuki sat in her barracks, numb. Hiroshima. Her mother's sister had lived there with her family. Her cousin Akiko, who was the same age as Yuki, and had been her closest friend in childhood. Her uncle who made the best mochi she had ever tasted. Her aunt who sang folk songs in a voice like honey. Gone now, vaporized in a flash of light brighter than the sun. 3 days later, another bomb fell on Nagasaki. The women gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed voices, trying to understand what was happening. Some refused to believe it. They insisted it was American propaganda designed to break their spirit, to force Japan into surrender through psychological warfare. But others looked at the faces of the American guards and saw something that could not be faked. Even the enemy seemed horrified by what their own country had done. Then came August 15th. The emperor himself spoke on the radio. His voice, heard by his subjects for the first time in history, told them to bear the unbearable, to endure the unendurable. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. The announcement guards gathered the prisoners in the yard that afternoon. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly, but no one complained. Everyone knew something momentous was happening. Sergeant Crawford stood on a small platform near the administration building. His face was grave, lined with exhaustion and something that might have been relief. "The war is over," he announced. "Japan has surrendered. You will be repatriated to your homeland as soon as arrangements can be made. Until then, you will continue to be treated according to the Geneva Convention. That is all." For a long moment, no one moved. Then a woman began to cry. Then another. Then the sound of weeping spread through the crowd like ripples on a pond. Dozens of voices releasing grief and relief and confusion all at once. Some women embraced. Some fell to their knees. Some stood frozen, unable to process that the war that had consumed their lives was finally finished. Yuki felt tears streaming down her face, but she was not sure what she was crying for. Relief that the dying would stop. Grief for everyone already lost. Fear of what she would find when she returned home. Joy that she might see her mother again. Terror that there might be no home left to return to. And beneath it all, a deeper ache. The war was over, but for her and Thomas, she realized with growing dread, the end of war meant something else entirely. It meant goodbye. The waiting. The weeks that followed were chaos. Red Cross workers arrived at the camp, setting up tables and filing cabinets, beginning the enormous task of processing hundreds of prisoners for repatriation. Lists were compiled, medical examinations conducted, paperwork completed in triplicate. Women who had been prisoners for months were suddenly civilians again, awaiting transport home to a country none of them recognized from the fragmentary reports filtering through. Letters began to arrive. Fragments of news from Japan, forwarded through military channels and Red Cross networks, revealing the extent of the devastation. Tokyo had been firebombed. Entire neighborhoods reduced to ash. Hundreds of thousands dead. The city Yuki had known, the streets she had walked, the school where she had taught, all of it might be gone. She waited for news of her family with a fear that made eating impossible and sleep a distant memory. The letter came in late September. A Red Cross volunteer handed it to her during mail distribution, a thin envelope with her name written in her mother's familiar hand. Yuki's fingers trembled so badly she could barely open it. The letter was short. Paper was scarce. Words were precious. Her mother was alive. The small neighborhood where they lived had been spared the worst of the firebombs. Their apartment still stood, though windows were broken and supplies were scarce. But Kenji. Yuki read the words 3 times before they penetrated. Kenji had been conscripted in the final months of the war. He had been sent to Okinawa in June, part of the desperate defense against the American invasion. There had been no word from him since. The military had declared him missing, presumed dead. She held the letter and felt something inside her crack and crumble. Her father gone when she was 12. Now her brother lost to a war that had already ended. The boy who drew pictures of birds. The teenager who dreamed of becoming an artist. The young man whose eyes held the same gray as their father's. Gone. She walked to the edge of the compound and stood at the fence, staring at the endless Texas sky, and wept until there were no tears left. The garden that night she found a note. Not in the book, which had been confiscated months ago, but tucked into her blanket, placed there by hands she did not see but recognized in the careful folding. It said, "Garden, tonight. Please." She should not have gone. She knew the danger. With the war over and repatriation imminent, the guards had relaxed their vigilance, but discovery would still mean trouble, for both of them. But she went anyway. The garden was quiet in the late summer heat. Vegetables hung heavy on their vines, tomatoes and squash and beans that would be harvested in the coming days. Cicadas droned their endless song. The sky above was vast, filled with stars that seemed close enough to touch. He stood waiting near the tomato plants, their old meeting place. His uniform was rumpled. His face was shadowed with exhaustion. She approached slowly, her heart pounding, stopping a few feet away. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched between them, filled with everything they had never been able to say. Then Thomas spoke, his English slow and careful. "You go home. Soon." Yuki nodded. "Yes," she said. "Maybe 1 week. Maybe 2. He was silent for a long moment. She could see him struggling with words, trying to find the right ones, trying to bridge the gap between what he felt and what he could express. "I hear about your brother," he finally said. "I am sorry." Yuki's eyes burned. She had not spoken of Kenji to anyone, but somehow he knew. Somehow he always knew. "Thank you," she whispered. More silence. The cicadas sang. A nightbird called somewhere in the darkness. Then Thomas stepped closer, lowering his voice to barely above a whisper. "I want to say something," he said. "Before you go, I want you to know." Yuki waited, barely breathing. He said, "In my life, I never think I meet someone like you. Enemy, they say. Prisoner, they say. But I not see enemy. I not see prisoner. I see person. I see you." His voice cracked slightly. He paused, gathered himself, continued. "My brother died because of hate, because world is full of hate. But you teach me something. You teach me that hate is choice, that I can choose different, that even in war, even in prison, people can see each other, can reach for each other." He looked at her, his eyes bright in the starlight. "I not forget you," he said. "Never. Wherever you go, whatever happened, I carry you here." He touched his chest, over his heart. Yuki felt tears streaming down her face. She did not wipe them away. The world tilted. The distance between them, the distance that had separated them for months, suddenly felt impossibly small. She wanted to reach for him, to close the gap, to hold him just once before the war took him away forever. But the risk was still too great, even now, even with everything ending. Instead, she whispered the only word she could manage. "Promise?" His eyes held hers, steady, unwavering. He gave the smallest nod. "Promise." They stood there in the darkness, the garden around them heavy with the scent of earth and growing things. Two people who had found each other across an impossible divide, saying goodbye without knowing if they would ever say hello again. Then footsteps approached, another guard making rounds. Thomas straightened. His face became neutral. He walked away without looking back. Yuki stood alone among the vegetables, pressing her hand to her heart, trying to hold on to the moment before it slipped away like water through her fingers. Departure. September 28th, 1945, the day of departure. Trucks waited at the camp gates, engines idling. The women who had been prisoners for months stood in formation one last time, their small bundles of possessions clutched tight. Yuki had almost nothing. A change of clothes. A small mirror Sachiko had given her. The scraps of paper she had saved, hidden in the lining of her jacket. The notes that were all she had left of him. Guards called names. Women climbed onto trucks. The process was efficient, impersonal. Just another logistical task in the aftermath of war. Yuki searched the yard desperately. Where was he? Then she saw him. Thomas stood at the edge of the yard, posture rigid, hands behind his back. He was in formation with the other guards, maintaining the protocol that had governed their lives for months. His face betrayed nothing, but his eyes found hers across the crowd. As Yuki climbed onto the truck, she slipped her hand into her sleeve. Folded there was a small scrap of paper on which she had written a single word in English, practiced until it was perfect. Promise. She held it up for him to see, just for a moment, just long enough for him to read. His lips curved into the ghost of a smile, the first real smile she had ever seen on his face. It transformed him, made him look younger, made him look like the boy he must have been before the war took everything. Then the truck lurched forward. She watched through the canvas flap as the camp grew smaller behind her. As Thomas became a figure, then a silhouette, then nothing at all. The Texas sky stretched overhead, vast and blue and indifferent. She pressed her hand to her chest where his words still echoed. I carry you here. She would carry him too, forever. The voyage to Japan took 3 weeks. The ship was crowded with returning prisoners, women and men separated into different sections, all of them haunted by the same questions. What would they find when they reached home? Who would be waiting? What would be left? Yuki spent most of the journey on deck, staring at the endless Pacific, watching the water change color from the deep blue of open ocean to the gray-green of coastal waters. Sachiko found her one evening, leaning against the rail as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold. You loved him, Sachiko said. The American. It was not a question. Yuki was silent for a long moment. The wind whipped her hair across her face. The ship rolled gently on the swells. Finally she said, I do not know what I feel. I only know that he was kind, and kindness is rare. Sachiko nodded slowly. The war taught us to hate, she said, but perhaps it also taught us that hate is not the only choice. Yuki looked at the horizon, where the sun was sinking into the water. Perhaps, she said, but it does not matter now. He is there. I am here. The ocean is between us. Sachiko put an arm around her shoulders. The ocean is large, she said, but so is the human heart. Yuki wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe that the connection they had built, word by word, note by note, glance by glance, could survive the vast distance that would soon separate them. But she had learned not to hope for things she could not control. She had learned that the world was not kind to those who dreamed too much. Tokyo, October 1945. Tokyo. The city Yuki returned to was not the city she had left. The train from the port crawled through landscapes of devastation. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble, block after block of gray ash and charred timber. Where buildings had stood, there were now only foundations and memories. Where families had lived, there were now only ghosts. The fire bombings of March had killed over 100,000 people in a single night. More than either atomic bomb. The deadliest air raid in human history, carried out not with nuclear weapons, but with incendiary bombs that turned the wooden buildings of Tokyo into an inferno that burned for days. Yuki stared through the train window, trying to find landmarks she recognized. The school where she had taught, the park where she had walked with her students, the neighborhood where she had grown up. Gone. All of it gone. She found her way to her old neighborhood through streets she barely recognized. Detours around rubble. Makeshift signs pointing toward shelters and relief stations. People moving through the destruction like sleepwalkers, their faces blank with shock. Her mother's apartment building still stood, miraculously spared. But the windows were broken. The walls were scorched. The garden where her mother had grown vegetables was now bare dirt, stripped of everything edible. She climbed the stairs on legs that trembled. She stood before the door, unable to knock, unable to face what waited on the other side. Then the door opened. Her mother stood there, gaunt and hollow-eyed. Aged a decade in the 2 years since Yuki had last seen her. For a long moment, neither moved, Neither spoke. Then her mother's face crumpled, and she collapsed into her daughter's arms, weeping. Yuki held her and wept too. Inside, they sat in the small room that had once been bright with her mother's sewing work. Now it was bare. The fabrics had been sold for food. The sewing machine had been traded for rice. The photographs of her father and Kenji were the only decorations remaining. Her mother told her everything. The firebombs, the nights spent in shelters, listening to the world burn, the hunger that made people eat things they never would have imagined, the shame of surrender, broadcast in the emperor's own voice. And Kenji. The letter had come in August, just days after the surrender. Missing, presumed dead. There would be no body to bury, no grave to visit, just an empty space where a young man with artist's hands had once been. Her mother asked, were they cruel? The Americans? Yuki thought of Thomas, of the lozenges left on her bunk, of the book with its penciled translations, of the garden and the promise and the smile she would never forget. No, she said. They were kind. Her mother stared at her as if she were speaking a foreign language. Kind? Yes, Yuki said. Some of them were kind. She did not explain further. She could not. The story was too strange, too personal, too fragile to share even with her mother. But she carried it with her, and she would carry it for the rest of her life. The years between life became survival. Yuki found work as a translator for the American occupation forces. Her English, sharpened by those penciled notes in a borrowed book, made her valuable. She helped Japanese civilians navigate the new bureaucracy. She helped American soldiers understand the people they were now governing. It was strange work, sitting in offices with men who wore the same uniforms as the guards who had watched her in Texas, speaking both languages, bridging both worlds, belonging fully to neither. She did not speak of Thomas. She did not write to him. She did not know how. The address she had memorized from one of his notes, a small town in Ohio, seemed impossibly far away. What would she say? That she missed him? That she thought of him every day? That she still carried the word promise in her pocket like a talisman? He had his life. She had hers. The war was over. The connection they had built was a beautiful dream, but dreams did not survive the harsh light of reality. Or so she told herself. Years passed. Japan rebuilt. The rubble was cleared. New buildings rose from the ashes. The occupation ended. Life continued. Yuki's mother recovered slowly, regaining strength and purpose as the world around them healed. She began sewing again, making clothes for neighbors, earning enough to survive. Yuki continued her translation work, then transitioned to teaching English at a small school. She was good at it, patient, kind. The students reminded her of the children she had taught before the war, curious and eager and full of hope. She never married. Suitors came and went, appropriate matches arranged by well-meaning friends and relatives. But none of them understood her. None of them saw her the way she needed to be seen. None of them were him. She kept the scraps of paper in a small box hidden in her closet. Sometimes, late at night, she would take them out and read them, trace the penciled words with her fingertip. Remember, same sky, different home. I not forget you. Promise. The letter, 7 years. 7 years of silence, of wondering, of forcing herself to move forward while part of her heart remained anchored in a Texas garden, in eyes that held no hatred, in a promise made beneath the stars. In the spring of 1952, Yuki received a letter. She had just returned from school, tired from a long day of teaching, when she found it waiting in her mailbox. A thin envelope with foreign stamps, American stamps, a postmark from Ohio. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. The handwriting on the front was rough, uncertain, but unmistakable. She knew that handwriting. She had traced those letters 1,000 times in the margins of a borrowed book. She carried the envelope inside and sat at her small table for a long time, just holding it, afraid to open it, afraid of what it might say, afraid that 7 years of silence meant he had forgotten, or moved on, or become someone who no longer remembered a Japanese prisoner and a promise made in a garden. Finally, she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in careful English. Words that had clearly been drafted and redrafted, practiced and perfected. Dear Yuki, I keep my promise. 7 years. I think of you every day. I did not write before because I did not know how. I did not know if you wanted to hear from me. I did not know if you remembered. But I remembered. I remembered everything. I remembered the garden. I remembered your eyes. I remembered the word you wrote for me. Promise. I am still in Ohio. My father died last year. My mother is alone now. I work at the factory in town. I save money. I dream. I dream of a day when I can see you again, when the ocean between us does not matter, when we can stand under the same sky, not as enemies, not as prisoner and guard, but as something else. I do not know if this is possible, but I know I have to try. Please write back. Please tell me you remember too. Yours, Thomas. Inside the envelope was a photograph. Thomas in civilian clothes, standing in front of a small white house, smiling shyly at the camera. He was thinner than she remembered, older, lines around his eyes that had not been there before. But his eyes were the same, calm, steady, human. Yuki pressed the letter to her chest and wept, not tears of sadness. Tears of something she had forgotten how to feel. Hope. The bridge. She wrote back that same day. Her letter was longer than his. She told him about Tokyo, about the rubble and the rebuilding, about the strange new world that had risen from the ashes of the old. She told him about her work, about her students, about her mother who was slowly recovering. She told him about Kenji, about the brother she had lost, about the grief that still found her in quiet moments, unexpected and overwhelming. She told him she had never stopped remembering. She told him she had kept her promise too. Their letters crossed the Pacific for 2 more years, hundreds of words building a new bridge across the ocean. Longer letters as their confidence grew, photographs exchanged, dreams shared. He wrote about Ohio, about the factory where he worked, about his mother who was growing frail, about Daniel whose memory he still carried every day. She wrote about Japan, about the students who made her laugh, about the cherry blossoms that had bloomed again in Ueno Park, about the small moments of beauty she found in a world still healing. Word by word, they rebuilt what the war had tried to destroy. And then, in 1954, he asked the question she had been waiting for. Will you let me come to you? The reunion. The ship arrived in Yokohama on a gray morning in October 1954. 9 years had passed since the garden, since the promise, since goodbye. Yuki stood at the port, surrounded by crowds of people waiting for arriving passengers, families reuniting, business travelers being met by colleagues, the noise and chaos of a busy harbor. She wore her best dress, blue with white flowers, chosen after hours of deliberation. Her hair was pinned up carefully. Her hands would not stop trembling. What if he had changed? What if the man who stepped off that ship was not the man she remembered? What if the connection they had built through letters dissolved when they faced each other in person? The gangway lowered. Passengers began to descend, a stream of faces she did not recognize. She searched desperately, her heart pounding. And then she saw him. He was walking down the gangway, a single suitcase in his hand. He wore a simple brown suit, slightly rumpled from the long voyage. His hair had grayed at the temples. His face was thinner, older. But his eyes were searching the crowd with the same desperate hope she felt. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither moved. The noise of the harbor faded. The crowd seemed to disappear. There was only him standing 20 feet away, close enough to touch if she had the courage. Then Thomas smiled. Not the ghost of a smile, a real smile. The smile of a man who had crossed an ocean for a promise made 9 years before. And Yuki ran. She pushed through the crowd, dignity forgotten, propriety abandoned. She ran toward him, and when she reached him, she threw her arms around his neck and held on as if she would never let go. He held her back just as tight. His arms were strong and warm and real. His heart beat against her chest, proof that this was not a dream, that he was here, that the bridge they had built across years and oceans had held. She was crying. He was crying. Neither cared who saw. Same sky, he whispered into her hair. Same home now. Epilogue. They married in Tokyo in the spring of 1955. It was a small ceremony. Her mother was there. still uncertain about this American who had come so far. Sachiko came, tears streaming down her face as she watched her friend find the happiness that had seemed impossible. Thomas's mother could not make the journey, but she sent a letter that Yuki would keep for the rest of her life. "Thank you for bringing my son back to life," the letter said. "After Daniel died, I thought I had lost both my boys, but you gave me one of them back. They lived first in Japan, then in America, building a life that bridged two cultures, two languages, two worlds. It was not always easy. People stared. People whispered. A Japanese woman and an American man, married just 10 years after the war, was not something their world was ready to accept. But they had already survived worse. They had survived war and prison and 7 years of separation. They had built a bridge across an ocean with nothing but words and faith and the stubborn refusal to forget. Compared to that, everything else was manageable. They had 3 children, a daughter named Hana for the cherry blossoms Yuki loved, a son named Daniel for the brother Thomas had lost, another daughter named Hope for what had sustained them through the darkest years. They grew old together in a small house in Ohio, surrounded by cornfields that stretched to the horizon under a vast American sky. Thomas worked at the factory until he retired, then spent his days tending a garden that reminded him of that garden in Texas where everything had begun. Yuki taught Japanese at the local high school, sharing her language and culture with students who had never known a world at war. They never forgot the garden, the notes, the book with its penciled translations. They never forgot that the hardest choice in war is not to hate, and they never forgot that the human heart, given the smallest opening, will always reach for connection. Thomas died in 1989 at the age of 70. He passed quietly in his sleep, with Yuki's hand in his. His last words to her, whispered the night before, were the same words he had written in the margins of a children's book 50 years earlier. Same sky, different home, but now, same home too. The message: Yuki lived another 15 years, passing away in 2004 at the age of 83. Her children found the box after she died, the small wooden box she had kept hidden in her closet for decades. Inside were the scraps of paper, the notes they had exchanged in a Texas prison camp in 1945, the letters that had crossed the Pacific, the photograph of a young American soldier standing in front of a White House, smiling shyly at the camera. And beneath everything, a single page in Yuki's careful handwriting. A letter she had written but never sent, addressed to no one in particular. Perhaps to her children, perhaps to the world, perhaps just to herself. "The war taught us to hate," the letter said. "It taught us that people on the other side of a line were enemies, monsters, less than human. But one man showed me that hate is a choice, that we can look at someone we are told to hate and see a person instead. That kindness can exist in the darkest places. That love can grow in the most impossible soil. Thomas Bennett saved my life. Not by giving me medicine or protecting me from harm. He saved my life by seeing me as human when the whole world told him I was not. That is what I want to remember. That is what I want the world to know. Same sky, same heart, same hope. That is all that matters in the end." The children kept the box, they kept the letters, they kept the story. And when people asked about their parents, about how a Japanese woman and an American soldier had found each other across the vast divide of war, they would tell the story. The story of a promise made in a garden. The story of words written in the margins of a borrowed book. The story of 2 people who looked at each other and saw not enemies, but something far more powerful, each other.